It's a very normal thing to say that the idea of Jesus' resurrection is ridiculous. If anyone came to us and said, well, I've seen someone who's been raised from the dead never to die again, then our first assumption should be that they're mad, because we don't see that happening. But then if their testimony, their evidence seems more and more reliable, we can begin to look into it. The really reassuring thing for us is that the way the first eyewitnesses approached the evidence was just like we would. They thought it was ridiculous, and then they examined the evidence for themselves. And so the first people to go and discover that Jesus had risen had gone to treat his dead body and embalm it and prepare it for burial. They were convinced Jesus was dead. They saw him die. They did not expect to see a resurrection. And those first eyewitnesses, very significantly, were women. And back in those days, the evidence of a woman in court was invalid. And so if you were inventing a story that you would want to look impressive to the people around you, you would not use women as your first eyewitness, which kind of must mean that the people who recorded this genuinely believed it to be true. They weren't making this up. And then the women told a bunch of men who had that assumption, oh, these are hysterical women, they must be making this up. And so they went and examined it for themselves. And so more and more people started examining and seeing and meeting the risen Jesus. And then there was one guy who was left until last, and he was very skeptical too. And his name was Thomas. And we're told in John's Gospel that Thomas said, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And then we're told a week later his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas, who was rightly skeptical, then realized that he'd seen the evidence, and he said, my Lord and my God. And that's the kind of process that we ought to go through. We should assume it's ridiculous and then examine the evidence and then see whether we can be convinced ourselves. And so if you're convinced by this few minutes answer, then that would be as ridiculous. But as you look into the evidence and you see that the testimony of these eyewitnesses and that the written evidence brings us back to a very, very early dating, within days of the events actually happening, and we realize that those written accounts are utterly reliable, then we too can go through the process of those early disciples and see what many have called the most grounded piece of ancient history is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.